So our next guest, we're going to continue with history, but this time we're talking about a different part of the country, and it's Georgia, or more specifically, Atlanta. And the book is called America's Black Capital: How African Americans Remade Atlanta in the Shadow of the Confederacy. And the author is a professor as well, and his name is Jeffrey Ogbar. And hopefully I pronounced Ogbar right. Um, Welcome to
Ogbar. It's a pleasure to be
Ogbar.
here. Yeah,
Okay, all
when
right.
O- when Obama got elected, it made it a lot easier. I was like, oh, like Obama. So Ogbar, it's
Okay,
a pleasure to be here.
Ogar. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on Black Authors Matter TV and telling us about your new book called America's Black Capital. And do you have a copy of the book with you?
I do. Let me see right here. Let me see
Okay.
if I don't know if it will come. There we go. Well, I disappear. And so
Yeah.
it's right here, and this is, let's see.
Keep keep
Yeah,
putting it close to you. I think if you put it close to
there we
you,
go.
there you go. Okay. And what is the picture that you use to depict for the cover? What is
It's a Yep, it's a picture of Atlanta's life insurance company that was started by Alonzo Herndon, who was the first African American millionaire in Atlanta. And the insurance company eventually became one of the biggest Black insurance companies in the country. And his son is Norris Herndon, who is in the center of this picture. In 1971, when Ebony Magazine was the first place to call Atlanta the Black Mecca, they talked about Norris Herndon, who was on the cover of this book as a much younger man. But at that time, according to Ebony Magazine, Norris was the wealthiest African American in the country. So, we think about entertainers. It wasn't, any athlete, wasn't anybody who sang, and not that there's anything wrong with singing or dancing. Wasn't Barry Gordy, but it was someone that many people are not familiar with. And that was Norris Herndon in 1971 in Atlanta.
Okay. And are you from Atlanta or from Georgia?
No, I'm from Los Angeles. I was born in Chicago, raised in LA, first grade through high school in LA, and I went to undergrad in Atlanta at Morehouse College, and that's my introduction to the putatively Black Mecca. And that's when I, in many ways, became sort of mesmerized and fascinated by the city.
Well, my daughter would be happy to know that she is a product of the AUC. She went to Clark Atlanta University.
Oh, nice, nice. Yep, fantastic. AUC Love, great.
Yes, yes. So you went to college in Atlanta and just never left?
No, I undergrad in Atlanta and went to graduate school at Indiana University and then settled in New England and Connecticut. So my first job out of grad school was University of Connecticut, and I've been there since 1997.
Oh,
Wow.
okay. So you are in the north, but you focused your book on. Then did you live in Atlanta once you graduated from college? Did you ever live there?
No. I spent 2 summers there in grad school, just teaching at Morehouse. I mean, like little summer classes. And but no, I never lived there at all beyond grad school and undergrad. And even grad school, we're talking about 2 summers. But Atlanta, is if I were to anthropomorphize the city, I would say that Atlanta is like a um a friend that you meet in undergrad, like in college, and never knew this person. You may have become roommates and then best of friends, and you go your separate ways, and you might not see that person for a year, but when you see that person, you pick up like nothing happened,
Right.
and you grow together over the years. And many of us have friends. Like the way I look at LA, where I grew up, LA is like a friend from my childhood. And I love that friend. We were close, but we've grown apart. I see him and we just reminisce over what we used to do back in the day.
And
And
then you
so
can't
we're
see
not, but Atlanta's that place that I've always kind of grown with. And as Atlanta has continued to expand, and as you probably know, it attracts, more Black people have migrated to Atlanta than any metropolitan area in the country in the last generation. And I see why, but that energy is very compelling. And I try to engage that in the book.
I live in the DC area, and I think that DC is a good competitor to Atlanta for the amount of Black people it attracts.
You know, you're not only right, I talk about that in the book. And the book, if there's any city that comes close to, you know, challenging Atlanta in so many different metrics, different areas, is DC. And I can spout a few of them. But the DC metro area, as you know, has a lot of affluent African American communities, suburban communities. The same thing stands for Atlanta. The metro areas, both are sort of massive draws to Black migration and a certain level of affluence also. And you have these, what I think makes these two places distinct is that they have these massive centers for Black education, Howard University and the Atlanta University Center. And so Howard is a much larger school than any AU Center school. I mean, so Morehouse, we're rivals with Howard, but you know, Morehouse, we have like 2,300 students. Howard has 11,000. I mean, there are multiples. If you took Spelman and Morehouse combined, Howard is still over twice our size. And so you take the entire University Center, AU Center, then you kind of approximate, but we're still not as large as Howard. So you see why you have such a prominent position of Black talent, sort of a community that has generated Black talent for generations. A lot of people stay in the community, taking advantage of the institutions, and they become critical incubators for leadership as well.
That's true. Now I'm going to give you all a stat since y'all are talking about numbers and migrations. Texas has more Black people than any other state. And you all can look that up. I was surprised when I found out. I was thinking it was second or third, but it's first. It's number one.
Don't
And
mess with Texas.
yeah.
That's what they say.
But see,
So
but
yeah.
it's the entire state. Is there any specific city that has a high concentration of Black people? I can venture to guess which city it is.
Well, Houston has a ton. You know, Harris County, which is comprised of Houston, has 5 million people, not 5 million Black people, but just the county of Harris County, which includes Houston, has 5 million people. And so Dallas it has a lot as well. And then we have the military, we have several military bases that have a lot of Black people. But I was surprised. Now, I can't tell you the number. It's more than 1 million, I'm pretty sure. But I know the state with the most Black people is Texas. And I forgot who was second because when I found out Texas was first, I didn't even really look that far into
No reason to look at second and third, right?
and I'm not a native, but I've been here a long time. So
Yeah.
anyway, we're everywhere, and where we are, we tend to concentrate because we like community. So, you know, the places where Black people are, there's swaths of America where there are no Black people, but there's parts where there's lots. So
Yeah, and I think
that's for once, you know.
yeah, and I think that's been a critical draw for Atlanta, right? Like we have here in I live in Hartford, Connecticut, and Hartford is 80% Black and Latino, and a lot of people think New England, Connecticut, and they think of is disproportionately white. The city is like I say, 80% Black and Latino. The state itself is one of the most representative states of America. It is, I think, second to Illinois, and maybe right above New Jersey in its representation of whites, blacks, Asians, and Latinos in a way that reflects the country. You know, so you take somewhere like Texas, or Texas and California, where Latinos are overrepresented or Asians are overrepresented in Hawaii in relation to their population, or Vermont is overrepresented with whites. Connecticut is really representative of the country, but we struggle to bring Black teachers to the city of Hartford. And part of that, according to people who say they're recruiting, I don't know how true this is, but they talk about just how difficult it is to bring Black teachers up to Hartford, or have them stay here. Atlanta, on the other hand, is 51% Black now. About 75% of the teachers are Black. You know, it's like, again, extreme high numbers in relation to the population. So there's a community and a sort of draw that I think people seek when they decide where they want to go to establish their professional careers. And to quote Julian Bond, who was a civil rights leader, one of the leaders of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and who was an state representative for Atlanta, Georgia. He said this back in the 1970s, but he told me again this in the 2000s, that before he passed, that if you are a Black professionally trained person who wants to explore his or her career, that there's no city better to maximize your talents and to fly as unfettered as possible than Atlanta. But he said if you're poor and Black, Atlanta will look like Memphis or Gary, Indiana. So that while you do have a whole bunch of Black folks who are doing extraordinarily well in the city, there are also, of course, Black folks who are not. And those who are not, I talk about this throughout the book. I mean, even 30, 40, or 100 years ago, you had Black people doing extraordinarily well in different spaces, but you also had Black people in pressing poverty. And that theme has always been around, these sort of class tensions and class divides. But people are drawn to the city, I think, oftentimes to see and participate in what we might measure as Black excellence.
Well, you have that educational complex where that's a sort of a farming breeding ground, for lack of a better term, for professional positions once they graduate.
Yeah.
So you have all those people coming there to be educated, and not all of them are from Georgia. No, it attracts people from all over, and then many of them stay there once they graduate.
And it's been that way for generations. So in my book, I talk about how a lot of people that we see as iconic African-American figures, like James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the novel Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, who also co-wrote the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. James Weldon Johnson, who was a diplomat, who was a civil rights activist, a novelist, NAACP leader, he got his education at Atlanta University, which became, merged with Clark College, became Clark Atlanta University. Walter White, who was the executive secretary to the NAACP, is a grad as well of Atlanta University. Du Bois, the most formidable, celebrated African-American intellectual ever, and one of the intellectual giants, period, in the United States in the 20th century, was a professor at Atlanta University. It was there where he wrote his seminal book, Souls on Black Folk. It was there when he sort of cut his teeth in seeing the most, vicious, uncivilized expressions of white supremacy, but also that it fired his desire to be more militant when he saw that sort of ugliness and the savagery of it all. And then you, of course, Dr. King, but I could go to this whole list of people who lived in Atlanta, were drawn to the city. And I mean, Maynard Jackson, whose dad, Maynard Jackson Sr., came from Texas. He went from Texas, went to Atlanta for college, and ultimately came back and became a minister, passed away, but he had his son with him, and his son stayed in Atlanta, and of course became the first Black mayor of a major Southern city. And so the city has drawn so many people to those universities and those colleges. They have been the nucleus for so much over the generations.
As you say all of that, which is all totally true, so many of our leaders were educated in Atlanta or in the South. But then you also mentioned how Atlanta is an overlooked center of the new Negro Renaissance, also known as the Harlem Renaissance. So how is it overlooked when there's been so many people who were educated there, who moved there to get a better life? How did it become overlooked?
It's an excellent question. So a lot of times, so historians have used this term, and I think most of us who are familiar with African American history we know of the Harlem Renaissance. And anyone who knows anything about the Harlem Renaissance will think about Harlem, New York City in the 1920s, and think of Zora Neale Hurston. We'll think of Langston Hughes. We'll think about the jazz artists. We'll think about all these expressions of African American intellectual, political work. And we might even think of Marcus Garvey and other folks, perhaps Du Bois even, who was active in the Harlem Renaissance. The thing is that at that moment, they did not call it the Harlem Renaissance. And Langston Hughes didn't refer to it as the Renaissance for decades, the Harlem Renaissance. And Alain Locke, who's a so-called dean of the Harlem Renaissance, who was a philosophy professor, Harvard-educated philosophy professor at Howard University, he used the term the New Negro Renaissance. And at that time, what was going on in Harlem was also going on in Chicago and Los Angeles in Washington, D.C. and other cities. And it was in the late 60s and early 70s that people started calling it the Harlem Renaissance instead of the New Negro. We were moving away from the word Negro, and then people didn't know what to come up, but they were like, all right, call it Harlem, because everyone knew Harlem as this conspicuously Black city or part of a city. So that term stuck, but what it did was mute all these other cities and all the contributions they made to the same moment. And a lot of times people have talked about Chicago as a major locus for this activity, but Harlem and Chicago cannot really, in many ways, compare to what was going on in Atlanta at that time. So in the 1920s and 1930s, there were Black newspapers all across the United States. And although there were cities with more Black people numerically, only one city in the United States of America had more Black people percentage-wise than Atlanta, Georgia in 1920 or 1930. That's how super Black Atlanta was as a percentage of the city, right? So it was even super Black back then. So at that time, all these Black newspapers existed across the United States, but there was one daily Black newspaper, and it was in Atlanta. It wasn't the Chicago Defender, wasn't New Amsterdam News, wasn't Pittsburgh Courier, but it was the Atlanta Daily News. And also we have in Atlanta at that time, this is the interesting thing for you, Dr. Lawson, is that in the early 1920s, African Americans in Atlanta were barred from public parks, from schools. In fact, in the beginning in 1921, there was no public high school that allowed Black students anywhere in the state of Georgia, including Atlanta, obviously, right? So African Americans who wanted their children to get a high school education had to pay money to go to a private school, and the Atlanta University Center schools offered secondary education. So we think of like Spelman and these places, but they actually had high schools, so girls could graduate high school. But check this out: in the early 1920s, not only did they ban Black people from going to public parks, hotels, restaurants, they had amusement parks throughout the city of Atlanta that refused to allow Black people in at any point. Some cities like Memphis would say, or Chicago, say, we won't allow Black people in except for one day a week, or except for Negro Day, some special day in the year, right?
Yeah.
That
Atlanta,
was a great thing.
They
yeah,
had
right.
that at beaches and amusement parks and even state fairs, and
It was crazy.
it
So
was.
Atlanta created the first, and this is the thing about DC. Atlanta created a place called Joyland Park. And Joyland Park opened in the early 1920s in Atlanta. It became the very first Black amusement park of its size and scope in the country. 2 weeks later, DC came around and offered they were already in the works, obviously, right? But 2 weeks later, that same month, in the month of May, DC opened its own Black-owned amusement park. And so DC and Atlanta, again, were neck and neck with all these sort of Black achievements. But yeah, in that time, in addition to not just having this daily Black newspaper or having this Black amusement park, African Americans had a little suburb they created. They actually had, in addition to all of this, we have the Apollo Theater in New York City, and we have Club Alabama in South Central Los Angeles. But they had two nightclubs in Atlanta that were Black owned, that were places where all the Black amusement, the sort of entertainment figures of the day came. And so, Duke Ellington, a series of everyone that you could think of came through these two clubs in Atlanta at this time. So Atlanta was a point where you have intellectual work, you have activists, you have the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Marcus Garvey comes down there. Infamously, he meets with the Ku Klux Klan in Atlanta, right, which actually destroys his reputation in the African American community. People saw him as a lapdog for the Klan and that kind of thing. So all these things happened in Atlanta in the 1920s in a way that far outstripped Black businesses in other cities as well. So yeah, Atlanta was a central part of the new Negro Renaissance in the 1920s.
And it's still now it's starting to be known for movie making now.
One of the
Tyler
largest,
Perry has really,
Mhm.
I'm sure there are other people, but Tyler Perry in particular has really transformed that. He's really opened the doors for a lot of people.
the largest Black-owned film and production center that Black people ever created anywhere is there in Atlanta right now, owned by a Black billionaire, right? And the place where he owns it is a Fort McPherson, which was tied to the Civil War. It was the highest ranked general in the Union side to die in battle. It was in the Battle of Atlanta, and the fort was named for him. It was a Union fort, but it became the site for this massive film and production place now that's Black owned.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Oh, I
They've
wanted to
done the
give an
crimes in the
update.
last couple of years.
It has. I wanted to give an update on the state population rankings. The viewers have given their input.
Everybody wants
Let's
to
hear
play the biggest state now. We have the most Black people. We have the most Black people. We have the
it.
most Black people.
Texas is first, and then Georgia, Florida, New York, and California in that order.
Well, that's all fine and good, y'all, but I'm just gonna put it out there. And I'm from New Orleans. I don't even know why I'm claiming all of this, but the area that has the highest per capita of high income Black people
It is. It's
and
Detroit.
is in PG County, Prince
Mhm.
George's County, Maryland, and now Howard County in Charles County. I mean, not Howard County, but Charles County. That's where your highest per capita of high income Black people are. So you'll have Black people living in $1 million neighborhoods.
Yeah, that's a stat that I know is true, and it's been that way for a while. It's been that way
Yeah,
for a while, and
yeah,
the federal government's presence had some bearing on it. But you also have a lot of educational institutions in the DC area. I went to one, Georgetown, but you have Howard and George Washington. You have American University. You have
Yeah.
University of Maryland.
yeah.
So you have a lot of Morgan State. So you have a lot of educational institutions similar to Atlanta in that there's a constant flow of graduates that can then take these professional positions.
Yeah, of all metro areas in the United States, DC has the highest percentage of African Americans with college degrees of any metro in the United States, and then Atlanta is number two. And the richest majority Black county is now Charles County, as you said, Dr. Lawson, and it passed up Prince George's County. I think it was
Yeah,
last year.
they're all moving to Waldorf. Yeah, I live in the sticks too, so I understand.
So
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Charles County, what are the cities, the suburban areas?
Waldorf, basically Waldorf.
Okay, Waldorf. Okay.
Yeah, and I live in Accokeek, which is right outside of Waldorf. So I live in Prince George's County, but I'm right down the street from Charles County.
Yeah.
But
Well,
you were telling your story, telling the story about Atlanta and the different areas. It made me think. I mentioned a little while ago, I'm from New Orleans, and there was Pontchartrain Beach, which was a segregated park in New Orleans, and so Black people had to go to Lincoln Beach, and Lincoln Beach was basically the Black beach in New Orleans. Yeah, we actually have beaches in New Orleans, believe it or not. And just in the last few years, there's been a big movement to reopen Lincoln Beach and reclaim some of that history, because once it closed down, and once desegregation happened, and Black people were like, "Oh, we can go to the white areas now." They just left Lincoln Beach sitting there. And a lot of the Black stores and the Black neighborhoods, they just kind of sat there, and everybody wanted to go to the white areas because now they were allowed to go. So fortunately, there's a huge movement in New Orleans to reclaim that history and to bring some of those areas back to their old splendor. So I'm really happy to hear that, and I think a lot of that is happening in Atlanta, even though I know that there's been a big movement toward kind of fighting against a lot of the gentrification in Atlanta, because they feel like a lot of that history is being taken away. There's still that faction that's trying to preserve the history in the city, which I think is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, so there's an area that, according to some people, and this is a longer story, but Fortune magazine allegedly said in 1954 that Auburn Avenue was the richest Negro street in the world. And whether it said it or not, a whole bunch of people have repeated that statement. And In 1954, and then back in 1920s, Auburn Avenue had emerged as this concentration of all sorts of Black business activity. And over the years, as you know, African Americans got access to the entire city, the Black center of of economic opportunity and commerce dispersed, and it's been all over the city now. And so Atlanta right now has the highest percentage of Black-owned businesses, the metro area per capita, of any metro in the country. And that's a good thing that people are all, I mean, that people, I don't think anyone ever thought that Black people should not have access to the entire city, right? I don't think anyone ever said we should never have access to the, and so if you, and one thing about Atlanta is that if you go to Buckhead, which is the most exclusive part of the city, and go to any restaurant on a Friday or Saturday night, you will always see a whole bunch of Black folks in a way that I don't see in any other city where I go. And there are areas, and I talk about gentrification because there's a lot that people say, but I look at numbers and data, and a lot of this will dispute what we think we see, right? Because I know we all know this term confirmation bias, and maybe many of the listeners also know about it. And confirmation bias is this idea that if you believe something, then every time you might see 15 examples of that being disproven, but the one time it's proven, that's your reason to believe what you believe, right? You're like, I told you so, right? And the other 14 are just dismissed because they're anomalies, although they were the majority, right? So when we think about Black people being, there's a narrative that we often have. I call it the declension thesis, this idea that Black communities have been in a state of decline since the civil rights movement. But I look at the numbers. I'm saying, okay, are Black businesses smaller than before, fewer than before? Do Black people live shorter lives? Do we have higher infant mortality rates? Do we achieve less in terms of graduation? So I look at all these important data points. And now look at Atlanta, right? So I have friends, smart people probably way smarter than I am. And they were saying that that Black people have been pushed out of Atlanta. The percentage of Black folks in Atlanta peaked in 1990 at 67%. Now, the percentage of Black people in Atlanta is about 50%, 51%. So a lot of people are like, Black people got pushed out, Black people can't live in Atlanta, Black people can't afford Atlanta, all this stuff. Let's look at the data. I have a whole chapter where I look at the data and how Atlanta has changed in the 21st century. So between 2010 and 2010 and 2020, more Black people moved into the city of Atlanta. And the city of Atlanta in 2020 would have had more Black people on record than any point in its history had not two sections of the city seceded from the city, including this place called South Fulton, which has 100,000 people now. South Fulton is the blackest city in the United States of America, over 100,000 people per the 2020 census. And that was a segment, it's like 90% Black. That's a segment that pulled away from Atlanta. And so Atlanta actually has more people in 2020 than any people in the history of the city of Atlanta. The thing is that while the percentage dropped, you had an influx of whites and Latinos and Asians simultaneously. So more people were coming into the city, period. More non-Black people were coming to the city, period. So this idea that Black people were being pushed out is not met with any data, right? The city's gotten more diverse and more people. Also, if you look at the incomes of people who live outside the city, they actually are wealthier than the people who live inside the city. So if you were poor, you would not be moving out of the city, since the city is actually cheaper to live in and the income levels are lower than people who live outside the city. And so it's really kind of interesting. I can't say this is the case with every city, but I do look at these sorts of numbers. And for some reason, I think, I like to think that this is what I tell people. Like Fannie Lou Hamer and John Lewis and Ella Baker and Angela Davis and King and Huey and everyone else, Malcolm. I like to think that their lives were not in vain. I like to think that after all the stuff they did, that Black people actually have made strides to continue to make strides, and not this idea that Black people have just only gone backwards. And historians will tell you that in the civil rights movement, if you look at the white supremacist governors and mayors and congressmen who fought against civil rights, one of the things they said very explicitly was that if we did not segregate Black folks, they would in fact not be able to compete with whites, and they would decline. Their quality of life would decline. And so in many ways, this idea that we are sort of always in a process of declining goes with an agreement of our most vicious adversaries who pushed against all the things that the people we love advocated for, right? And so I can't again speak for Cincinnati and Detroit and Chicago, a lot of these other places. When I look at Atlanta, there's no way to think that we aren't better off than we were, although the city has a whole bunch of problems. And I talk about those too, like there are pronounced problems with social mobility in Atlanta. I mean, one of the metrics about Atlanta is that of all the cities in the United States, has a lowest level of social mobility. It's number one with social immobility. A child born in a poor community in Atlanta, she has a 4% chance of escaping poverty into the middle class. And that's the worst of any city in the country. But then if you expand it to the metro area, all of a sudden Atlanta drops from number one worst to the 222nd, 227th worst. So it plummets. So it speaks a lot to what the metro area has sort of done in terms of Black achievement, Black success, and Black innovation.
Wow, I
We
could talk
would
to
love
you.
to continue to talk about
Yeah.
Atlanta, but we actually passed our time. So we want to let you show the book cover one last time and tell people that they can go and get the book America's Black Capital. And he's coming in and out, but we can see him, America's Black
Oh, America's
Capital.
Black Cattle. I know
It's
this is
about
terrible.
it's about
There we go.
Atlanta, how African Americans remade Atlanta in the shadow of the Confederacy. So we've had a very, very vigorous and interesting conversations. It's all about us in the United States and
Yes, I enjoyed it.
how we're growing and thriving. So it's great, and Atlanta is known as the Mecca, especially in the South for Black people. So thank you for being a guest on Black Authors Matter TV. And we want people to go out and get your book. And congratulations on releasing it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you both. It was fantastic. Thank you very much and wish you the best.
And thank
Okay.
you. You have a
Happy
great
New
one.
Year.
Best as well.
Happy
All
New
right.
Year to you.
All right. Thank you.